In Harlem, you could rob Bumpy Johnson. You could betray him. You could even try to kill him. But if you ever disrespected his wife, you didn't get a warning. Tonight, I'll tell you the true story of how a young Frank Lucas spoke one dirty sentence in a backroom bar. And by the next night, he was on his knees, begging a living legend for mercy. Not because of a gun, not because of blood, but because in Harlem, some words were more dangerous than bullets. Harlem, 1963. 3. Rain slid slowly down broken streetlights, like the city itself was scared to cry too loud. In this neighborhood, nobody feared the police sirens anymore. They feared silence. The kind of silence that followed a single name. Bumpy Johnson. A name spoken carefully. A name carried on breath, never on laughter. A name that ruled blocks' corners and lives without ever needing to shout. And most of all, there was one rule everyone understood without being taught. You never brought Bumpy's family into street talk. Not in anger, not in jokes, not even in whispers. But Frank Lucas was still young enough to believe that words were light. Back then, he wasn't a king. He wasn't even a prince. He was a runner. A fast shadow slipping between men who mattered. He delivered envelopes. He carried messages. He stood outside doors he would never be invited through. But every time he stood close to power, he felt it pulling on him. He didn't want to stay close. He wanted inside. Frank had sharp eyes and quiet patience. He listened more than he spoke. He watched how Bumpy's men moved, how they didn't rush, how nobody questioned them, how respect came before money. But hunger makes people careless. That night, a small backroom bar behind Lenox Avenue was heavy with smoke and cheap courage. A dirty ceiling fan dragged warm air across sweaty faces. The radio crackled out an old love song that nobody was listening to. Cards slapped against a crooked table. Empty glasses crowded the edges like soldiers who had already lost. Men were talking about scores, about runners, about who was rising and who was falling. And sooner or later, every conversation in Harlem drifted toward the same place. Bumpy. Someone mentioned how quiet he had been lately. Someone said that quiet meant planning. Someone laughed nervously. Then, almost accidentally, a man at the table said her name. Bumpy's wife. Not with disrespect, not with humor, just as part of a sentence, a soft reference, a harmless detail. But Frank leaned back in his chair. He felt eyes on him. He felt the moment waiting for him to fill it. He smiled. The kind of smile men wear when they want to be seen. And then he said it. A dirty joke. A small sentence. A cheap, careless line meant to pull laughter out of the room. The kind of joke that sounded powerful in his own head. The kind that made him feel bold. For half a second, nothing happened. His words floated in the air unfinished. Then the room collapsed. The laughter stopped like someone had cut a wire. The cards froze in a man's hand. The radio kept singing about love, but the song suddenly sounded wrong in a room that had just lost its breath. Nobody smiled. Nobody answered. One man slowly pushed his chair back. The legs scraped the floor. He stood up. Didn't look at Frank. Didn't say a word. He walked out through the back door like the building had caught fire. Frank's smile stayed on his face, but it no longer belonged there. He tried to soften the moment with another small laugh. Nothing came back. Only lowered eyes. Only tightened jaws. Only the quiet understanding that something had been damaged. Not broken. Damaged. Frank felt a strange pressure in his chest. Not fear. Confusion. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't stolen. He hadn't even raised his voice. It was just a joke. But the room didn't treat it that way. Because everyone inside that bar knew something Frank didn't yet fully understand. In Harlem, respect wasn't a rule. It was oxygen. And he had just sucked it out of the room. Someone finally picked up his cards. Too slowly. Another man cleared his throat and stared at the table like it had betrayed him. Nobody looked at Frank. That was the worst part. Being ignored in a room full of men who normally watched everything. Frank stood up, straightened his jacket, told himself he was overthinking it. Men were soft sometimes. Men panicked over nothing. He had heard worse jokes than that. He walked toward the door. The bartender avoided his eyes. Frank paused for a second, waiting for someone to call his name. Nobody did. Outside, the rain felt colder than it should have. He lit a cigarette with shaking fingers and told himself it was only the weather. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet thought refused to leave. You shouldn't have said that. Frank didn't know how fast stories moved through Harlem. He didn't know how every corner had ears. How every runner had a reason to talk. 3. How one man leaving a bar without a word could turn into 5 men, carrying the same message by sunrise. He didn't know that while he walked down wet pavement, shaking water off his collar, his sentence was already traveling. Not as a joke, not as gossip, as information, precise, careful, deadly. By the time Frank reached the next block, someone had already repeated his words. By the time he reached the next street, someone had already added his name. 3. By the time he disappeared into the crowd, the story had found its direction. It was moving toward one quiet office. Toward one calm man. Toward one closed book waiting to be opened. And by morning, 3. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson would hear exactly what Frank Lucas had said about the only person in Harlem who did not belong to the streets. When that happened, someone else's future would begin to vanish. Silently, without warning, without mercy. Bumpy Johnson was sitting alone. A single lamp glowed beside his desk, spreading soft yellow light across the quiet room. Outside, Harlem was restless and loud. But inside that office, the world moved slower. Books lined the wall behind him. Real books, not decorations. He read the way other men sharpen knives. A man stepped in quietly. He stood near the door, hands folded in front of him, breathing carefully. "Sir." Bumpy did not look up. There was something said last night. The words hesitated in the air. "About your wife." The page stopped turning. Bumpy closed the book. Not quickly, not angrily, gently. The sound of paper touching paper felt louder than it should have. He lifted his eyes. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he stood. That was all. No questions. No names. No instructions. The man by the door understood. In Harlem, real power did not repeat itself. It simply moved. Frank Lucas felt it before anyone touched him. The streets no longer spoke to him the same way. When he passed a corner, conversations lowered themselves without effort. A runner who usually nodded at him turned his head. A man who owed him a favor pretended not to notice him standing only 3 feet away. It wasn't anger. It was distance. In this city, distance was danger. Frank walked slower than usual, listening to his own footsteps echo between wet buildings. He kept telling himself nothing had happened. Men were dramatic. Men were scared of shadows. But still, nobody laughed with him that day. By late afternoon, even the small favors disappeared. A door that usually opened for him stayed closed. A message he was supposed to carry suddenly no longer existed. The street had rewritten him. Quietly. By evening, the silence became heavier than noise. Frank stood outside a storefront and watched traffic crawl past, the rain smearing red brake lights into long streaks across the pavement. Something had shifted. He could feel it, and he could not see it. 2 men stepped out from a narrow doorway, not together, one after the other, as if they had always been standing there. They didn't look angry. They didn't look rushed. They looked like men finishing a task. Frank opened his mouth. He never found the words. A hand grabbed his collar. Another struck his ribs. The wall rushed into his shoulder. Pain spread fast and sharp. Then a knee. Then the pavement. It didn't last long. It didn't need to. They weren't there to punish him. They were there to collect him. One of the men leaned close to his ear. His breath was calm. "Mr. Johnson wants to see you." The name emptied Frank's chest. Not a threat. Not an insult. Just a fact. The kind you cannot run from. The car was already waiting. Black. Quiet. Frank was pushed into the back seat, not roughly, but firmly. He sat in the middle. The doors closed with soft final sounds. No one spoke. The engine rolled forward. Streetlights slid across the glass like slow, moving ghosts. Frank stared at his hands. They would not stop trembling. He searched for explanations that could survive the night. A joke. A misunderstanding. Someone exaggerating what he said. But he knew. Deep down, he already knew. This wasn't confusion. This was clarity. The city had decided he needed to explain himself to one man, and only one man. The car turned twice, then slowed. Then stopped. The driver opened the door. Frank stepped out into a quiet street. A building waited. Plain. Unremarkable. 3. The kind of place you would never notice unless you were told to notice it. Inside, the hallway smelled of old wood and warm dust. Footsteps moved softly ahead of him. A door opened. Light spilled across the floor. Frank entered. The office was warm. Too comfortable for a dangerous place. Heavy curtains softened the street outside. Books covered the shelves. A clean desk sat at the center of the room, and behind it, Bumpy Johnson. He didn't look dangerous. He looked calm, which was far worse. "Sit." Frank sat. The chair felt too small. His back refused to straighten. "You work hard," Bumpy said quietly. Frank nodded. "Yes, sir." "You listen well." Another nod. "Yes, sir." Bumpy watched him carefully, as if deciding which parts of him were real. "I hear you spoke about my wife." The words were gentle, almost polite. Frank leaned forward slightly. "I was joking, sir. I didn't mean nothing by it. People talk. Bumpy lifted one finger. Only one. The room obeyed. "I didn't ask why." Frank froze. "I asked if you did." His mouth opened, closed. His throat tightened. "Yes!" The word landed between them like a dropped glass. It did not shatter. It waited. Bumpy did not move. He studied Frank's face, not with anger, with curiosity, as if he were examining a tool to see whether it still worked. Frank could hear his own breathing. Too loud, too fast. The silence stretched, not empty, heavy, full. This was not a pause. This was a space where decisions were made. Bumpy finally stood. Slowly, unhurried. The kind of movement that told Frank something very clearly. Nothing in this room was out of control. Not even him. As Bumpy stepped away from the desk, Frank felt the air change. Not fear yet. Expectation. The terrible kind, because the question had been answered. And now, only the consequence remained. Bumpy moved slowly. Not because he was old, because nothing in that room required speed. He walked around the edge of the desk, the soft carpet swallowing the sound of his shoes. Frank stayed frozen in the chair, staring straight ahead, afraid that even turning his head might invite something he could not take back. "My enemies speak my name every day," Bumpy said calmly. His voice carried no heat, no pride, just truth. "They curse it. They drag it through the streets. They try to break what I built." He took another quiet step. "They steal from me." Another step. "They plan to kill me." Frank's jaw tightened. He could feel Bumpy behind him now. Not touching him. Not close enough to feel breath. Close enough to feel presence. "But my wife." The words slowed. A silence opened after them, a deep one. "Does not belong to this world." Frank's fingers clenched against his knees. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. That was the line. That was the thing he hadn't understood inside that smoky bar. Business could be fought. Power could be stolen. But family was not part of the game. "You crossed something that does not belong to you," Bumpy said softly. Frank tried to speak. The sound collapsed in his throat. "I didn't think," he finally whispered. The words sounded small. They sounded useless. Bumpy did not answer. Silence pressed down on Frank's shoulders like weight. Not violent, not sharp, heavy. The kind that makes your body bend without being pushed. He felt something break open in his chest. A slow realization. This was not about punishment. This was about permission. Permission to live. And he didn't have it yet. Frank slid forward in the chair. The wood creaked softly. Then his knees touched the carpet. The movement surprised even him. It felt automatic, natural, like gravity. He lowered himself until both knees were on the floor. The chair stood behind him like something he no longer deserved. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson," he said. The words came out shaking. I swear I didn't mean it." His voice cracked in the middle. "Not for drama. For survival. I was trying to be funny. I was trying to fit in. I didn't think about what I was saying." He swallowed hard. "I didn't mean no harm." The room did not react. Frank bent forward. "Not all the way."
Not yet, but enough.
"I'll do anything you want," he whispered. "I'll work harder. I'll stay quiet. I'll disappear if you want me to." His breath trembled. He could feel tears building behind his eyes. Not because he was weak. Because fear does not care who you are. Bumpy looked down at him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Frank could not lift his head. He felt small. Not in body, in worth. The future he had imagined for himself suddenly felt childish, fragile, like something drawn on fogged glass. "If I forgive business," Bumpy said slowly. Frank's head lifted just slightly. "It is because business can be repaired." A pause. A careful one. "Business can be replaced." Frank's hands pressed flat against the carpet. "But family." Bumpy stopped. The word hung in the air. Incomplete. The silence after it felt intentional. "Cannot." Frank's body folded forward. His forehead touched the floor. The carpet was warm. Soft. He hadn't expected that. The detail felt cruel. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the fabric. "I didn't mean to bring her into anything." His shoulders shook. Just once. Then again. Quietly. Controlled. No loud sobbing. No begging sounds. Just breath failing to stay steady. "I didn't know," he said. But even as he said it, he knew how weak it sounded. Everyone knew. That was the point. Bumpy remained still. 3. Looking down at a young man who was learning the cost of being careless in a world that never forgave it. He did not raise his voice. He did not insult him. He did not strike him. He let the moment do the work. "You are young," Bumpy finally said. Not kindly, not cruelly, simply accurately. And young men confuse courage with noise. Frank's lips parted. He could not respond. "Being loud does not make you powerful." Bumpy continued. "Being reckless does not make you respected." Another pause. "It only makes you visible." Frank squeezed his eyes shut. He understood. Not intellectually. Physically, in his bones. Visibility in Harlem was dangerous. Bumpy stepped away. The movement was small, but Frank felt it. The shift of weight. The change in the room. He stayed on the floor. He did not dare move. Because the worst part still hadn't arrived. The decision. The sentence. The end of the moment. Everything inside him waited for a single sound. A single word. A single breath spoken differently. If Bumpy chose it. Frank Lucas would not walk out of that office alive. Not because of rage. Not because of anger. But because some lines, once crossed, demanded balance. and Frank was still kneeling, waiting to discover whether his life was heavy enough to pay for it. The room stayed quiet. Not empty. Waiting. Frank remained on his knees, his forehead still touching the carpet. He could feel his pulse inside his ears. Every second stretched longer than the one before it. He did not know how long he had been down there. Time had lost its shape. Somewhere behind him, a chair shifted softly. Then a small sound, a book touching wood. Bumpy turned away. Not sharply, not with anger, with decision. Frank felt it before he understood it. The weight in the room changed. Not lighter, different. Get up. The words were not loud. They were not soft either. They were final. Frank lifted his head slowly, afraid that he had imagined them. His knees burned as he pushed himself upright. He did not stand immediately. He waited, as if the floor might suddenly claim him again. But nothing happened. He rose. His legs shook beneath him. Bumpy was back at his desk. The book rested open in his hands, as if the last few minutes had not existed at all. Go back to work, Bumpy said calmly. Frank stared at him, still unsure, still waiting for the real sentence. It came quietly. You don't owe me loyalty. Frank's chest tightened. The words confused him. Loyalty was what men killed for, what they demanded, what they pretended to believe in. Bumpy closed the book, looked at him. You owe me silence. The line entered Frank slowly, then completely. He nodded. Once, then again. Yes, sir. His voice barely held together. Bumpy did not acknowledge the answer. He had already moved past it. The moment had ended. Frank stood there, breathing carefully, afraid to disturb the space any further. Then Bumpy spoke again. Earn the mercy you were given today. Frank's throat closed. He nodded harder. Yes, sir. That was all. No threats, no conditions, no lecture. Just a door quietly opened somewhere in the room behind him. He turned, walked. Every step felt fragile, as if something invisible might still reach out and pull him back. But nothing did. The hallway waited exactly as it had before. Plain, quiet, indifferent. Frank walked down the corridor with slow, careful steps. Not because anyone was watching him, but because he had learned, in one short hour, how thin his place in the world truly was. The door closed behind him. The sound echoed through the building like a soft punctuation mark. Outside, the night air struck his face. Cool, sharp, real. He drew in a breath so deep it hurt his chest. He was alive. The thought felt strange, almost undeserved. The car was gone. The street was empty. No escort, no shadow, no reminder, which somehow made the mercy heavier. Frank stood still for a long moment, listening to the distant traffic and the hum of Harlem settling into its late night rhythm. People laughed somewhere down the block. A radio played from an open window. 3. Life continued without acknowledging how close his own had come to stopping. He buttoned his jacket with trembling fingers, then began to walk. Each step away from the building felt unreal. 3. As if the city might suddenly correct itself. But Harlem accepted him back without ceremony. That frightened him more than violence ever could. By the time Frank reached the corner, something inside him had changed. Not his ambition, not his hunger. Those were still there. But the shape of them had shifted. He no longer confused noise with power. He no longer confused courage with attention. 3. He understood now that the most dangerous men in the city were not the loud ones. They were the quiet ones. The ones who could erase you without moving their voice above a whisper. Years later, people would talk about Frank Lucas like he had been born fearless, like he had been built for violence, like the streets had carved him into something sharp. They would talk about his rise, his connections, his money, his organization, his nerve, but none of them would know about a small, warm office filled with books. 3. None of them would know about the night he knelt on a carpet and learned what power truly felt like. They would never hear about the way his hands shook when he tried to light his first cigarette after walking out alive. 3. They would never hear about how the flame danced wildly because his fingers would not steady. They would never know that for a long time afterward, whenever someone laughed too loudly near him, his chest tightened because laughter had once nearly buried him. 53. Frank reached the corner and stopped beneath a flickering streetlight. He leaned against the cold metal pole and closed his eyes for a brief second. Not in relief, in memory, in warning. From that night forward, Frank Lucas never spoke lightly about family. Not his own. Not anyone else's. He learned where lines truly existed, and more importantly, who had the authority to draw them. He learned that mercy was not kindness. It was strategy. It was weight. 3. It was a debt that followed you longer than fear ever could. Bumpy Johnson had not spared him because he was weak. He had spared him because he understood something far deeper. A man who survives his own execution does not forget who stayed his hand. Frank opened his eyes and pushed himself away from the pole. He disappeared into the moving shadows of Harlem, alive, quiet, changed. 3. Because sometimes the cruelest punishment in the underworld is not death. It is being allowed to carry your mistake for the rest of your life.